Welcome to the jungle, baby. You're going to Dinotopia. That's right, folks. In this video, we are going to be digging into the first Dinotopia book by James Gurney. It's a beautifully illustrated book that takes us on a journey to a mythical island, populated by cultured and intelligent dinosaurs living alongside human beings, making it at least 10% cooler than this masterpiece. The story is presented in the literary equivalent of a mockumentary, using the journal of 19th century explorer Arthur Denison as the lens through which we experience this adventure. So in a way, it probably has more in common with Spinal Tap than Jurassic Park. In this video, I will take us on an abridged journey through the book, identifying points of interest, exploring suggestions of philosophy and ideology, and pulling at any interesting threads we find upon the way. So what are you waiting for? Grab your machete and check your canteen. We're off to see some dinosaurs. James Gurney, the author and artist, opens the book by explaining that he discovered an old sketchbook entitled Dinotopia by Arthur and Will Denison in a university library. It immediately grounds the author and the world of Dinotopia in the same setting, and by extension, it creates the possibility that Dinotopia exists in our world too, giving it a fun little immersive sheen. The full title of the leather-bound sketchbook is Dinotopia by Arthur and Will Denison, being the account of our adventures and discoveries on a lost island, and it begins with how it was that the father and son team ended up on the mysterious island of Dinotopia. The first entry is dated the 10th of November 1862, and it is written by Arthur explaining that he and his son Will were shipwrecked after their boat was hit by a typhoon whilst they were in uncharted waters, having recently left Hong Kong. They had been at sea for around 2 years, having gone exploring after the death of Arthur's wife and Will's mother, and would have likely also perished had it not been for the dolphins which had carried them to shallow waters after they were swept overboard. Finding themselves on the shore of a tropical island, Arthur and Will quickly find a freshwater stream and start to take stock of the world around them when they begin to hear what they describe as bellowing noises from the jungle. Now this is the point where it could have become a horror, but luckily for the many children that will have encountered this book, Gurney went in a different direction. They find a suspiciously large three-toed footprint on the beach, so they are pretty wary as they make their way further into the island, though in true horror protagonist style, they do still head towards the mysterious and monstrous noises coming from the dark of the forest, as opposed to running and hiding like I would have. They are wary enough, however, that when they encounter a small and cute looking dinosaur, Arthur attempts to brain it with a rock. Yes folks, Arthur nearly kills a creature that looks not unlike Sarah from Millennial Touchstone The Land Before Time with a rock. Fear not though, dear viewer, as it turns out that Arthur throws about as well as he sails, and only grazes the poor creature lightly on the leg. Following both this underwhelming attack and the rather dramatic cry and fall from our saurian friend, a selection of larger dinosaurs suddenly emerge from the trees and quickly surround Arthur and Will, grunting and stamping and essentially letting them know that those assembled aren't particularly impressed with what Arthur has done. After a few seconds of aggressive posturing, a human girl called Sylvia emerges from behind these disgruntled reptiles and starts to soothe them with some dinosaur whispering before cautiously approaching Arthur and Will and beckoning them both to follow, which, after some consternation, they agree to do. They travel down a mud road that Arthur notes is twice the breadth of those in America. In the muddy places I measured wheel ruts 15 feet apart. And this is the first indication of how much thought is given to how a world designed for cohabitation between dinosaurs and people might work. After all, the infrastructure needed for the travel of creatures that can grow to dozens of meters long and weigh tens of tons is something that would have to be factored into any kind of civilization that wanted to include them. The movement of labour and goods is the circulatory system of an economy, and having access to creatures that are capable of moving tons of goods in one go would logically incentivise the building of a network that could accommodate their movement between trade centres. Arthur and Will soon come to a hatchery, where human workers tend dinosaur eggs, and Arthur is shocked to see that the dinosaurs roam freely. To my astonishment, these creatures were allowed to roam free of fences or harnesses, strutting about like roosters in a farmyard, and accorded the greatest respect by all of the people. They are made a bed nest by Sylvia's father Giorgio, the bed nest being an interesting cultural appropriation taken from the dinosaurs, and they are then tended to and looked after by their new hosts. Smaller dinosaurs tend to the eggs of the hatchery directly, and we see the first instance of a social contract amongst the dinosaurs when we note that those tending the eggs in the image shown are known as oviraptors, with the origins of the genus referring to egg-stealing habits. Why is that important? Well, you have a species that paleontologists believe survived by stealing and consuming the eggs of other species, actually suppressing their instincts in order to meet social expectation and to play a supporting role in a communal hatchery. In this section of the journal, we are also introduced to another of author James Gurney's imagined solutions as to how a civilization that included huge dinosaurs could work, when we get to see the dinosaur chair. Oh yes. The picture explains more than words ever could, but for me it illustrates how much thought has gone into even the most basic building blocks of this fictional society, and this is a big part of why Dinotopia presents such a compelling world in my opinion. It's an almost Pratchett-like eye for quirky world building, and I love it. In the morning, Arthur and Will are met by Alec Orchardwine, which is a great name, who Arthur describes as being able to converse in an archaic form of English, though this might actually be a bit of shade from Arthur given that Alec is clearly Scottish. He seemed to search the air above his head for words, then said to Will something that sounded like, "Wilcany wee laddie." Alec then goes on to lore dump a bit and explains that most of the humans of the island can trace their origins to a shipwreck of some kind, and most were rescued by the friendly neighbourhood dolphins that surround the isle. It is also revealed that rather than use arbitrary units, Dinotopians measure time in things like generations, with Alec revealing that he was 15 mothers English, meaning that his ancestors arrived here from England 15 generations ago, although the English part I'm still a bit suspicious of. We learn from Alec that humans and dinosaurs live mostly peacefully together as equals, though Alec doesn't expand on the most important word in that sentence, that being mostly. Arthur agrees, as he speculates in his journal that he can't imagine T-Rexes are able to coexist peacefully with anything that can fit in their mouth. A fair assessment, I think, and it's something Gurney does deal with a bit later on. Arthur also notes in their journal during the course of breakfast that they are served juice, tea, soup, bread and nuts. No milk, no meat, and no eggs. Now this is perhaps unsurprising given that their society has a majority of egg layers and herbivores, but it does hit home that this society has chosen a powerful social contract and a mutual understanding that there must be compromises in order for everyone to coexist peaceably. How all of this is enforced remains a bit of a mystery, and perhaps a necessary one in order to protect the innocence of what is primarily a children's story, but it still bears consideration in terms of the wider world building of Dinotopia. Arthur then provides a number of sketches about life in the hatchery, detailing the way that local children help out at the hatchery, and reveals that as much as humans play an important role in the management of the hatching of eggs, dinosaurs also help out in looking after human children, such as with this fun looking fellow. I think my favourite element is the pipe organ that appears to be in the main nesting room, and the note, "can be performed by large feet." Imagine being in labour and turning to see a stegosaurus banging out some Stairway to Heaven on the pipe organ. Anyway, we are informed that the dinosaurs of this island only lay 2 or 3 fertile eggs in their lifetime, and this is explained as being a trait evolved in response to the scarcity of predators. In this way, the population is stabilised. This is a narratively convenient evolution, and I imagine this was part of Gurney's attempt to rationalise how a society without predators wouldn't overpopulate. And I'm willing to bet this was preferable to the rather more delicate subject of dinosaur contraception in a book that was largely aimed at kids. Still though, it again goes to show the importance that Gurney assigns to the coherence of this fictional world that he even thinks about these things at all. Will has become quite enamoured with young Sylvia by this point, and both he and Arthur start trying to learn the local human language, which is described as being a blend of many, a sort of linguistic melting pot of many cultures and languages. They both also acknowledge that they will likely not be leaving in the immediate future, though Arthur is careful to point out that leaving is still a priority for him, seeing as how his old world capital, both financial and social, are of no consequence here. A few days pass and Arthur explains how the locals are excited to hear more about life back in the human world, but with one interesting observation. Our kind hosts have been pecking at me with eager questions about the outside world. I have told them a little about Darwin and Huxley's new theories, and have described to their infinite amusement the recent display of life-size dinosaur models at the Crystal Palace in London. They seem relatively uninterested in developments like the compound steam engine. This is an interesting observation, and one that the author clearly wants us to think about. Why would someone who has grown up removed from greater human society be so dismissive of technological advancements like the steam engine? I suppose the advantages of being able to move large quantities of people and stock around are somewhat less impressive on an island where a diplodocus can carry whatever is needed, but I think this also has some wider implications in terms of the island's attitude towards technology and consumption. This is something we will come back to later as we learn a bit more about how Dinotopia functions. Giorgio and Alec confirm that no one has ever left the island, and any attempt to do so would likely be unsuccessful due to the reef's tides and mysterious winds that surround the island, and this rocks Arthur back into his seat a little. It is also revealed that Arthur and Will have to travel to Waterfall City to register their arrival as citizens of Dinotopia and their skills for use by the society of the island. The fact that such a nation has a bureaucratic function and looks to track and administer all citizens is a bit of a surprise and increases the scope of what we mean when we say the word society on Dinotopia. Clearly, all citizens are meant to be educated as to the exact nature of the social contract they are expected to adopt, and to contribute to the upkeep of society in some way, given that they ask new citizens to provide details of their skill sets and expertise upon registration. This may suggest a form of collectivism, where all contribute to the good of the whole, if with skills and labour here more than capital and earning. No mention has been made of pay or recompense for any of this work, and we are told that currency isn't really used here. Indeed, everyone we have encountered to this point has shared their food, water and homes without any expectation of payment other than that guests help out around the house and provide info on the outside world. Arthur bristles somewhat at the suggestion that they would have to register themselves and their skills, and I think we have to bear in mind what we know of Arthur's life back in the old world to understand that. Arthur refers to himself as a biologist and an explorer, and makes mention of how Dinotopia would be a mecca for a biologist, both of which suggest a privileged education and access to wealth that allows them to charter ships and be at sea for 2 years. The TLDR version being Arthur clearly has capital, and as such is used to a world where if you have the money, you call the shots. Arthur's sense of ideological alienation is only heightened when we see his handwritten note revealing that barter has replaced coinage as a system of exchange. Oof, that's a body shot to any wealthy capitalist. It would seem that Dinotopia has rejected the concept of capitalism and embraced a sort of utopian collectivism, meaning that they have achieved the same level of wisdom as the Federation in Star Trek, and that is good enough for me. Now, in a further dent to Arthur's ego, the only transport headed for Waterfall City are these great dung wagons, which Arthur understatedly describes as certainly no Cinderella coach. The only other passengers present are the dung traders themselves and some reptilians that seem utterly uninterested in engaging with Arthur and Will, talking in a language that is different to anything they have encountered so far. Funnily though, the main thing concerning Arthur is the smell, which he describes as being worse than anything he'd experienced in London, New York, or even Philadelphia, which feels pretty darn rude to Philadelphia. Arthur also mentions on the journey that the dung wagons, and I will never miss an opportunity to say those words, pass some ancient ruins that seem to suggest a previous civilization existed here, but is unable to look any closer at this time. Now, it's probably worth a quick sidebar here to just mention that this island is populated by dinosaurs, creatures that have existed for millions of years. So were these ancient ruins from an even older civilization? Or was it once another dinosaur city that has since crumbled to dust? Perhaps before Dinotopia was able to universalize its social contract, or near enough, it warred and plotted much like human nations have throughout history. The convoy soon arrives at the outskirts of a small city called Puktuk, where a bunch of dung starts getting loaded into the wagons to be used as fertiliser on the surrounding farms, which seems a pretty solid sustainability practice, to be fair. The people that are shoveling the dung onto the wagons are revealed to be the Copro Carters and are described as being esteemed dung connoisseurs, part of a respected trade and lineage on the island. Indeed, one of the Copro Carters assumes that Arthur and Will must also be fertiliser connoisseurs, riding as they are in the dung wagons, recommending his exquisite age-ripened product as a Frenchman might speak of Gruyere or Camembert. There is something sort of romantic about workers being able to take pride in what they do, in being able to recognise and celebrate the importance of their role in wider society, in being able to express the nuances and qualities of something that they are truly an expert in. Societies that can build respect into every trade and service would surely be a better aspiration than our current approach, talking about unskilled labour and looking down our nose at professions that are considered in some way lesser. Anyone that has ever worked an unskilled job will know that there is nothing unskilled or lesser about the work that they do. Before we move on, I just wanted to draw attention to this neat diagram of how a giant dinosaur toilet works. You would want a decent hat in that job. We then cut to Arthur and Will arriving in the city of Puktuk, and we get to see this wonderful image of a huge central street, flanked by market stalls, colourful decorations and some rather stylish looking dinos. There is a fair amount we can learn from this one image with regards to how life looks in a city designed for beings ranging from tiny little guys all the way up to the titans of the dinosaur world. We see a human and bipedal dinosaur trading for flowers, indicating that dinosaurs are involved in both trade and the concept of luxury goods, which is interesting because up until now, whilst there were certainly signs of interaction between human and dinosaur, it was only in terms of things that are functional to life itself. Seeing a dinosaur that has potentially grown and traded decorative flowers gives us a strong indication that concepts like art, decoration and gifting are also shared behaviours, making Dinotopia a much more culturally integrated society than we might otherwise think. We can see a sauropod lifting a human being up using a seated harness in order for them to water some flowers that sit right next to the apex of what I take to be some form of street light. We see a Dimetrodon, I think, that looks like it enjoys its work about as much as I do, and we get to see the pure brilliance of a tricked out stegosaur rocking some killer threads and some serious bling. I mean, check out that medallion. So we learn that the dinosaurs not only enjoy fashion, but also in marking themselves out as individuals, which again is an interesting and surprising concept we might not immediately think of when considering how such a nation would function. This is because early on in the book, we see humans accommodating dinosaur behaviours and trappings, working in a hatchery, sleeping in nests, eating a vegan diet in respect of their egg-laying peers. At that stage, it feels like Dinotopia is fundamentally a dinosaur nation that has accepted a human minority on the premise that it integrates itself with their ways of living. However, this snapshot of the city shows us that the integration has perhaps worked in both directions, with humans influencing the dinosaurs as well, creating a blend of all as opposed to having a one-sided monoculture. On this street, we see examples of traffic guides whose job it is to guide the huge dinosaurs around the busy city streets without stepping on any of the smaller creatures and people. We can also see lots of examples of the Dinotopian written language that uses combinations of three-toed footprints to construct the various words and forms of their language. In fact, later in the book, Arthur notes down the exact forms of the dinosaur alphabet, which is fun, allowing for readers to translate and create their own writings should the mood take them. After a little while spent marvelling at the many craftspeople, traders and local characters, Arthur and Will are approached by a quirky human called Lee Crab, who explains that they too are a recent newcomer, having been dragged to Dinotopia by the dolphins 9 years ago. Importantly for us, Lee Crab is the first person we encounter who has a negative view of Dinotopia and is quick to suggest caution. You think the name means a utopia of dinosaurs? Wrong. Look it up. It means terrible place. I know. I've seen it. The skinnies are the slaves of the scalies. We're all slaves, hatching their eggs, hauling their dung. Or like me, I'm a slag man. Escape. Not today, nor tomorrow. You've had your last grog and your last roast mutton, my good friends, my good skinnies. Lee explains that he is headed for Volcanium, which is described as being a factory town on the route to Waterfall City. The idea of a dedicated factory town suggests some sort of industrial focus that up to now has been largely missing from most of what we have seen of this isle. Lee further suggests that Volcanium is a good place to live without drawing attention, and this adds to the feeling that perhaps Volcanium is a more human-centric place with a focus on industry, metals and machinery. Whether out of snobbery or a more general sense of caution, Arthur is sceptical of Lee's theories and conclusions, despite recognising the fact that he remains the only other human that has expressed any desire to leave Dinotopia so far. There is something in Mr. Crabbe's manner that does not put me entirely at ease. But at the moment he is the only person who has echoed my own desire for returning home. Whether or not Dinotopia is the prison he claims, we shall see once we get to Volcanium. Upon arriving at Volcanium, we are shown a workshop run by the wild-eyed human blacksmith Tok Timbu, who quickly warms to Arthur's tales of modern foundry methods and the development of mills. Arthur asks Tok to confirm Lee's stories of slavery and imprisonment, which Tok laughs off immediately, pointing out that no one tries to stop you leaving because there simply isn't any way to leave, and mentions that Lee was obsessed with the legends of an underground tunnel near Waterfall City that leads off of the island, which naturally sets Arthur's mind racing. Whilst Arthur and Tok discuss the rumours and legends of these underground passages and hidden cities, Will is busy integrating himself into Dinotopian society, working at Tok's smithy and generally making himself useful, whilst his father focuses on escape and maintaining a scientific distance from the things he sees. It might be that this is a bit of generational commentary about the conservatism that comes with age and the more open and acceptive nature of youth. Arthur writes their journals with an eye to providing scientific and anthropological insights back in the real world, whereas Will is instead becoming part of Dinotopia, making friends, learning skills, and seeing a future here. Once Will sees a Skybax rider for the first time, I think his fate is sealed. Effectively a courier, Skybax riders fly around the island delivering maps, blueprints, medicines, and toys from the back of, and excuse my pronunciation here, Quetzalcoatlus Skybax, a huge great pterosaur not unlike those found in mediocre Smurf movie Avatar. The Skybax riders have a saying which Will adopts almost immediately: breathe deep, seek peace. And we are told this comes from the dolphins, and it carries a philosophical resonance due to the way that dolphins live in the water despite needing to breathe air. Or to put it much more eloquently, as per Tok Timbu, dolphins owe their genial good nature and their playfulness to an almost perfect adaptation to their watery home, allowing them to flourish despite being air breathers. For this reason, the phrase has been widely adopted on Dinotopia, given its thematic sympathies with the way that people arrive on the island and the philosophy of peaceful coexistence adopted by the nation itself. This sentiment is further enforced by an image of a Skybax rider greeting a Ceratosaurus, a predatory carnivore that has seemingly accepted a life without hunting and killing in order to exist in the wider society. Before leaving, the Skybax rider reveals that they are waiting to welcome you at Waterfall City, a vaguely ominous but revealing comment that gives us an understanding of how quickly information can travel around Dinotopia, using couriers like the Skybax riders as a form of messenger. Will unsurprisingly expresses a desire to become a Skybax rider, and Tok explains what that path looks like for a dolphinback, and in doing so reveals a little of the social reproduction of Dinotopia. Tok tells him that they are first to travel to Waterfall City to declare themselves and to be registered as citizens. Then they will be given a state education in writing, history and ethics. History and ethics are a logical choice, given that the Dinotopian authorities can effectively choose how young people will perceive the world and shape what is considered good and evil, much like we do in the human world. As a British child, I was taught about the Tudors, ancient Rome, and loads about the Second World War, but not so much about colonial aggression, acts of genocide, or royal sympathies towards fascism pre-Second World War. Ultimately, a state shapes its identity and legacy through its children, and in this way, Dinotopia is no different. It needn't be a nefarious or negative thing, of course, but it all depends on what you show, and perhaps more importantly, what you don't. After their education is completed at Waterfall City, Will would then be invited to attend a summer camp in Tree Town, where young people and dinosaurs practice living in accord, and finally to a canyon in the east where pilots win the trust of their reptilian partners. Tok suggests that Arthur and Will take a guide with them to aid their journey to the city, and rather amusingly, Tok suggests Bix, the Protoceratops they encountered when they first made it to the island. You know, the one Arthur tried to brain with a rock. It turns out Bix, apart from being slightly melodramatic about injuries, is also an ambassador and translator, and is one of the few dinosaurs who can speak human languages, so it's a pretty good choice as a guide for newbies to Dinotopia. It also turns out that she has a sense of humour when she greets Arthur. Breathe deep, seek peace, Arthur Denison. No rocks, I hope. Arthur notices that she still bears the bandage from where the rock had hit her, despite the fact it clearly serves no purpose at this point other than as a badge of honour for the young dinosaur. I now understand Bix's exaggerated reaction to the minor injury I inflicted, unaccustomed as she is to any deliberate attack. They all set out for Waterfall City, and Bix takes them on a swampy shortcut that leads to a fun little village made up of crested hadrosaurs and humans, where they stay a few days to dry out and take in this different lifestyle. Life here is heavily influenced by the aforementioned hadrosaurs, who communicate with nearby settlements using their distinctive hoots and calls. The humans of these dwellings also get involved by playing specially designed instruments to match the specific variant of hadrosaur to which they were assigned, as well as dressing in similar colours. James Gurney seems keen at all times to remind us that infrastructure means information too, and we have now seen word travel by road, air and sound, all of which allows the nation to be apprised of what is occurring at any one point. They eventually leave the swampy village and head up the river to where they catch their first glimpse of Waterfall City, and to be fair, it is what it says on the tin. And then some. The architecture looks like a mixture of ancient human cultures, with sphinxes from Africa, stepped pyramids from South America, some pagoda-style roofing from Asia, and some more square traditional buildings of a European feel. It all at once feels exotic, dynamic and wondrous, with waterfalls flowing all around, and the golden stone used to build the city marking it out as something fantastical. It also feels like a location someone might pick for defensive purposes, given its fast-moving moats on all sides, and it also boasts some rather impressive city walls, indicating that this consideration was likely a part of its history. Was there some war in the past that necessitated such a difficult location to access? Something linked to those ancient ruins, perhaps? The choices made in the city's location and architectural security lead us to the question of how to access the city, a question that James Gurney has a rather compelling answer to. And no, it's not airships this time. Yep, access to the city, for those not able to wade through huge fast-flowing rivers, is by pterosaur. Sort of. Just strap yourself into this rickety-looking glider and pray to whatever deity you believe in, as there are just a few strips of fabric and bamboo keeping you from plummeting to a very wet, very splatty death. Or, as Arthur himself puts it, I took some time, seeking first to convince myself that the silk and bamboo structure was sound and that our weight would not overload the vessel. Then, filled with apprehension, I boarded, trusting my life to the skill of the captain, who dashed out over the boisterous falls with an alacrity born of necessity. Yep, your life also relies on the old captain having done his stretches this morning, because if he pulls a muscle mid-run, your trip to the city has become a hell of a lot shorter. After a rather exciting and scenic trip around the city, they land the glider in an open square and are met by a colourful crowd, which is a refreshing attitude to immigration compared to what I am used to here on Normal Island. They then proceed to be celebrated all the way to the Office of Registration. Arthur describes the process of being registered as having an atmosphere of warm enthusiasm, rather than the authoritarian coldness he was expecting, and before long they are taken to stay in a state-funded hostel designed for use by visitors to the city. After a few days of some gentle tourism, Arthur begins their studies by visiting the timekeeper for Dinotopia, a bipedal dinosaur called Malik, who goes on to explain that dinosaurs view time by its effect on the world rather than in arbitrary time units. As Malik puts it, you of the West think of time moving in a straight line, from past to present to future. Your Eastern brothers regard time as a circle, returning endlessly in a cycle of decay and rebirth. Both ideas have a dimension of the truth. The Dinotopians instead see time as a combination of these two theories, a spiral or helix where time moves on but history repeats itself. Malik then reveals a complex device he calls the helicoid geochronograph, a constantly moving spiral clock which signals when significant events are due to happen, like some sort of a wild Willy Wonka style contraption. A mechanism climbed up the spiralling ledge, reading carvings, At intervals, coloured flags would rise, whistles would sound, or pebbles would drop down onto brass bells. Arthur observes that the turning of the spiral is dictated by the movement of the river, which has both a practical and philosophical dimension. Practically, it acts as a kinetic power source, a renewable, non-polluting means of turning the great timepiece, and another nod to how Dinotopia seems to have an intrinsic tendency towards sustainability, whether through choice or indeed convenience. Philosophically, Dinotopian time is focused on the measurement of time via the world around you, by the natural cycles of life, death and maturation, as opposed to the movement of orbital bodies, and the use of the river contributes to that sort of feeling. Rivers ebb and flow, they rise and fall, their speed increases and decreases, and to use this as the means by which your nation's time is measured has significant repercussions. There is a natural inconsistency there that chimes with the way that Dinotopia even uses time, as explained further by Malik when Arthur asks what the current time is. Time for Kentrosaurus to hatch, time to plant the millet, time for the magnolia buds to open. Professor Denison, I'm afraid you persist in thinking of time as numbers. You think of meaningless units of time. Weeks, hours, minutes. Based on what? Movements of faraway planets? Of what use to us is that? Why not pay attention to the precise 30-year life cycles of the bamboo Guajua Trinai, or the exactly repeating mitotic cycle of the paramecium? The whole Earth has a heartbeat. The Dinotopians move to a slower rhythm, and I think this explains a lot about why they are more sustainable in their approach, and the reason they have seemingly not succumbed to capitalism and the sort of short-term exploitation we're used to seeing in our world. Malik goes on to discuss how the erosion of the waterfalls all around the city necessitate periodic diversions of the rivers and the reconstructions of the cliffs beneath the city, before giving Arthur a pocket version of the Great Spiral Clock. I can't be the only one that kind of wants one of those. We also see a small drawing in Arthur's journal, a series of relay beacons utilising crystals to transmit beams of light to other towers many miles away. We don't know what information these relay signals transmit, but it is another example of a non-machinery based solution to communication in Dinotopia. But again, there are just hints of a more martial past, perhaps, in the existence of these signal towers. Arthur next meets Nalan and Enid, a human and Deinonychus that both work in the city's library, and they take him through the dinosaur alphabet and the basics of dinosaur literature, which is amusing and an interesting bunch of background fluff. James Gurney tackles the issue of how dinosaurs might read, and comes up with some funny machines that allow a clawed bipedal dinosaur to read scrolls without damaging them. And it is these little details that give Dinotopia so much of its character and warmth, along with the dinosaur couches and the stegosaur bling, of course. Ultimately, this is a fantastical setting aimed at kids, so your world has to be fun first and foremost, and these little touches do exactly that. Arthur observes that the library contains a massive amount of information and correctly surmises. By comparison to this vast storehouse of ideas, the Library of Alexandria would have seemed a puny collection cataloguing only the few short millennia of human wisdom. Dinosaurs have mused and argued and dreamed and reasoned for tens of millions of years, watching all things from their calm, wrinkled eyes. Nalab suggests a visit to a tablet at the top of one of the pyramids of Waterfall City, one entitled The Code of Dinotopia, and this, dear viewer, is a key part of understanding the culture, philosophy, and ultimately the social contract of Dinotopia. Here are the details as they are carved. Survival of all or none. One raindrop raises the sea. Weapons are enemies even to their owners. Give more, take less. Others first, self last. Observe, listen and learn. Do one thing at a time. Sing every day, exercise imagination. Eat to live, don't live to eat. Don't put remaining text missing. We will go through this in a bit more detail later, but it is a really useful piece of world-building lore, and it allows us to understand what underpins this thriving nation of dinosaurs and humans, though it does not ever seem to touch on the consequences of not obeying these mandates. Nalab also reveals at this time that the humans of Dinotopia tend to live much longer due to a herb native to the island, and that he himself is 126 years old, but Arthur mostly laughs that off because Well, you would, wouldn't you? Over the next few days, Arthur experiences the city guided by Nallab, and after seeing the many wonders and curiosities, he's left in some confusion as to how such a place can exist without a visible authority to enforce the peace. I can't imagine how all these different people and dinosaurs can possibly all get along without quarrelling. Nallab answers almost nonchalantly, "Oh, it is possible, but only if you do imagine it." This feels like a commentary on the concept of the Overton window, the idea that there are subjects which are considered socially acceptable to discuss and debate, and that anything that falls beyond those bounds are considered unrealistic, unpalatable, or taboo. Nallab seems to be suggesting that for such an integrated, diverse, and pleasant desire to exist, there needs to be the political will to make it so, and that in the human world such thoughts are often diverted by the more common buzzword of pragmatism, or other convenient disruptors to the radical politics of optimism. There is also a little bit of defund the police about the concept of dealing with violence and crime without resorting to employing those exact same behaviours. It is around here in the book where we then have a time jump of around 18 months, during which time young Will educates themselves with an eye to becoming a Skybax rider, whilst Arthur teaches human technological developments at the library. Arthur mentions having found some old charts that detailed the tunnels underneath Waterfall City, but that these are considered little more than mythical tales related to old dinosaur beliefs in a subterranean afterlife, and are treated in the same way we would treat a map of Camelot or Robin Hood's treetop hideout. All the same, Arthur is still intrigued by these tales of vast underground caverns and tunnels, though they do also admit that they have lost any real drive to leave Dinotopia by this point. Arthur seems to have rediscovered the joy of science and exploration for its own sake again, as opposed as a means for accumulating clout and money, and he seems happier for it. He learns of a colder, more mountainous region of Dinotopia where prehistoric mammals exist, and is informed by Bix that meat eaters still exist there, as well as in the surrounding plains, including, to everyone's joy, tyrannosaurs. This news greets us at the same time that we learn that Will and Arthur are to join a caravan headed through those same plains to visit Tree Town, in the company of some scribes attending a habitat conference. In this, we learn that not all creatures in Dinotopia have signed up to the same social contract after all, and that environmentalism is a big enough part of life on Dinotopia that there are conferences about it. Preparations begin for the journey through the territories of the Tyrannosaurs, and we are shown huge suits of armour being placed on an Apatosaurus, as well as various forms of saddlebags and people carrying paraphernalia. The conversations the Dinotopians have about the Tyrannosaurs show an enlightened understanding of the nature of crime and violence, and their mixture of food bribes and deterrence reinforce their commitment to non-violence, as evidenced this time by armoured Apatosaurus Korokadinga. "Ours is an invitation," she said, "not a challenge. Tyrannosaurus Rex is not evil, only hungry by nature, with no love for society and no stomach for green food. That is why we carry fish." We get to see another of James Gurney's fun inventions as the convoy crosses what is described as a vertical drawbridge into the jungles outside the city, and it works exactly as you might think, lowering as the beasts walk across it and then raising itself as they leave the end of it. They aren't far into the jungle trail towards Tree Town when the convoy pulls up and forms a defensive circle just before a T-Rex emerges from the trees and regards them hungrily. Bix, acting as translator and negotiator, uses the stored fish meat as a means to bribe the great predator, and also mentions that this is given so that the T-Rex will leave alone the undefended dinosaurs that will follow on this same path tomorrow. Obviously, this is a lie, Bix knowing full well that the T-Rex would break any bargain, but that the promise of easier prey tomorrow would mean it's more likely to let them pass today. After a few days of travel, the party arrives at a huge temple ruin, and there they meet with representatives from the other regions in order to discuss the state of the island and ensure that the environment is being maintained properly. This proactive and clearly important work on preserving their environment is perhaps the result of such a long-lived civilization, and one that thinks in terms of centuries as opposed to years, and one that values sustainability over the exploitation of natural resources. After the conference, the convoy continues up to Tree Town, which is a very fun looking place, though probably not a lot of fun if you suffer from vertigo. And sadly no Ewoks. Tree Town is nominally controlled, or perhaps better described as organised, by a matriarchal character called Nora, and even as guests, Will and Arthur are quickly given tasks, such as to help load and unload from the pulley systems that connect the treetops with the huge dinosaurs below. In Dinotopia, one commonality is that everyone is expected to contribute as much as they are able, but in return will be treated as part of the family wherever they are. It is a culture of give and take that appears flexible enough to accommodate and recognise the different abilities of everyone involved, which is an improvement on anything we have in my country. There are still some interesting elements that Gurney has included in Treetop's operating, such as how the boys all sleep in a big dormitory together and the adults sleep in a more central hub, using these cosy looking hanging baskets, or how a bell rings at the end of the evening denoting that all residents must put out their fires and go to bed, which feels a little bit wartime Britain, doesn't it? Do they put out the fires and lights to avoid signalling their presence? That seems unlikely given the scale of the place, so is it just a productivity and safety rule designed to ensure that the admittedly flammable treetop villages don't burn down and to ensure that everyone is able to contribute fully the following day? Incidentally, there is another little note scrawled by Arthur that backs up the environmental credentials of Dinotopia, explaining that all of the lumber used in Treetown came from a forest that was felled by a storm 3 centuries ago. And this again is another little nod to the amount of thought Gurney has given the construction philosophies of this island. Arthur also writes a little here about the mysterious herb that Nallab had mentioned back in Waterfall City, the one that can apparently extend human lifetimes to several hundred years with regular consumption. The root is gathered, dried and prepared in a tea-like infusion using waters of the springs near Bent Root and offered to humans after they have reached 24 summers. The claim often made is that the tea changes the body's chemistry to reverse the aging process. Thus a human can approach or even exceed the long lifespans of the dinosaurs, known to live beyond their 250th year. Arthur concedes that he can't disprove that this herb prolongs life, and so has resigned himself to drinking it, just in case, and this seems like a sensible bet to me. I mean, you would too, wouldn't you? There then follows a number of musings about the relationships between dinosaurs and people, and talk of the various forms of communication that vary from physical signals to musical messaging to spoken word, before we are then shown how, at the end of a learning term, for the younger people at least, there is a dinosaur Olympics. Now it's not as cool as you think, but it's still pretty cool. The 4 different quadrants of the island compete to collect rings suspended above a racetrack, whilst riding large 2-legged dinosaurs, before heading to the eldest dinosaur present to choose the habitat they intend to dedicate their lives to. For example, Will and his friend Sylvia from the hatchery both pick Sky, since they want to be Skybacks riders. As a result, Arthur, Will and Sylvia head off to Canyon City next, riding a huge convoy of apatosaurs so that Will and Sylvia can begin their pilot training. The city itself feels like something out of Star Wars and wouldn't be out of place on Tatooine or Jeddah, with its natural flow of shapes and domiciles built into the very cliffs that make up the city. Arthur, however, points out the difficulties of traversing such a city if you are not a Skybacks rider, describing it as like a wharf to a man without a boat, since each Skybacks can only take 1 rider and no passengers. Those who haven't bonded with their Skybacks have to rely instead on a series of trails, climbs and rope bridges to make their way to the higher points where the winged beasts roost. Ulu, the Skybacks flight instructor, explains to those assembled that as pterosaurs, Skybacks do not understand human or dinosaur languages, and that as such the relationship between pilot and Skybacks is one of trust and behaviour as opposed to language. He also describes how the Skybacks and their sister species, the Pteranodon, exist very separately, with the Skybacks ruling the sky and the Pteranodon instead living in the canyons that guard the world beneath, meaning that the Skybacks will not fly into certain areas. Arthur is intrigued by this mention of the world beneath, rekindling his interest in the old charts and maps of the underworld, and when he finds Bix and Ulu a little bit reluctant to expand on any questions he has, he becomes a bit more fascinated with finding out for himself. Arthur decides to explore the underworld and in doing so discovers something of an elephant's graveyard, a place where dinosaurs have come to die for centuries in surroundings full of ancient carvings from the times that humans and dinosaurs first met. It was hushed and sombre, clearly a holy place to the great creatures, who in their last days would come here by choice to review the sacred sculptures and to give their flesh for the renewal of life. Whilst down there, Arthur identifies several species of edible plant, and so he spontaneously decides to go on an expedition and explore further, and in doing so leaves the journal in the hands of Will, who we then follow for the next little while. Will is in the midst of their Skybacks training and is spending a lot of time with Sylvia and Bix, the latter of whom has explained how the underworld tunnels were once used by the Dinotopians to survive the extinction event that killed the dinosaurs everywhere else. As Bix puts it, somewhere in the canyon walls the story is carved. Long, long ago, before humans started coming, the sky went black with dust and it got very cold. The dinosaurs here collected seeds, spores, insects, everything, and took themselves and the whole lot underground. Will's journal entries go on to talk of the challenges of building a working relationship with their Skyback, Cirrus, and of how much he is missing his father, who'd been gone for about a month now. It is worth reminding everyone that at this point Will is probably 13 or 14 years old, and so is very young to have been left to fend for themselves. Ulu, the Skybacks instructor, advises that for Will to fully partner with his Skyback Cirrus, he must go on a sort of pilgrimage and climb to the temple known as the Tent Pole of the Sky. This is a very difficult and dangerous climb, but Will is game, and he and Sylvia begin readying for the journey whilst Bix wisely declines to join them, stating, "Family business," and amusingly she wasn't lying. James Gurney once again flexes his imagination and gives us a dinosaur speaking platform, several dinosaur relaxing couches, and probably my favourite thing here, the shell lamp. So, a few days later, Sylvia and Will head off to attempt the climb, passing some slightly phallic looking monuments of trilobites before encountering the colder mountain villages where the ancient mammals live. Will mentions in the journal that apparently saber-toothed tigers roam the mountainsides up here, and like the T-Rexes, they pay zero mind to the laws and cultures of Dinotopia. It was with this in mind that Will and Sylvia accept the help of a mammoth that offered to take them up at least some of the way. Eventually, after much climbing, they do successfully arrive at the temple, the tent pole in the sky, and are told that the temple being built there was a Dinotopian idea, designed to provide privacy and isolation for those that need it, which is a remarkably thoughtful idea, especially given what an absolute bloody nightmare it would have been to build there. We also learn that the temple's news and supplies are brought by a floating balloon boat called a sky galley. Those of you that have watched my video on Above the Timberline will have noted my like of these delicate little sky bubbles, and it is genuinely funny how often airships appear in fantasy and sci-fi settings. The children yearn for the skies. The sky galley arrives to take Will and Sylvia back towards Canyon City, but being an airship, it is immediately blown off course by a storm and wrecked in a field of flowers close to Sauropolis, the capital of Dinotopia. That was lucky. They arrive in Sauropolis to discover that they've just missed Arthur and Bix, who had returned from Arthur's expedition using a sort of weird steampunk submarine that Arthur had built, and then they just left recently for Waterfall City. Sauropolis is in the midst of its festival to honour children and hatchlings, and so is awash with noise and colour and celebration, but it's all a bit much for Sylvia and Will, who choose to watch from a high vantage point, and who are eventually met by their Skybacks mounts, who are now fully paired with them and ready to take them off to their lives as Skybacks riders. Pretty awesome. After an inaugural flight, they arrive back at Waterfall City and are greeted by Bix, who explains that they went into the subterranean tunnel after Arthur, breaking Dinotopian taboos in doing so, but that all is well and Will's father is in the library discussing their findings with the city's intellectuals. There is a great and emotional reunion, and Arthur closes the book with a final journal entry, marvelling at Will and Sylvia's growing maturity and celebrating the changes he himself has undergone during his time on Dinotopia. He leaves us with the following promise, and something of a sequel teaser. There is a long lifetime of work to do here. I cannot start soon enough. Let's have a look at a couple of the larger thematic elements that have piqued my interest. When considering fictional worlds, I am naturally inclined to think primarily about the ideological aspects of why certain decisions are taken, as you will see when we come to the second theme in particular. However, I did find that there were quite a few moments where I found Gurney's choice to try and ground Dinotopia, at least somewhat in reality, forced me to examine some facets of this world in a different light. For example, we are told that the dinosaurs in Dinotopia only lay 2 or 3 fertile eggs in their lifetimes, and that this level of reproduction evolved as a response to the longer lifespans they were experiencing on this unique island. Now, if this hadn't been the case, Clearly the island could have quickly become overpopulated, seeing as how they had largely removed the threat from predators and had instigated healthcare and agricultural systems that would have raised the already considerable dinosaur life expectancy. As a world builder, Gurney clearly identified that there needed to be some sort of balance to the reproductive rates on the island, and then it became a question of how it would fit the world he had built and the tone of the story. A government edict on the maximum number of children, religious abstinence, widespread adoption of contraceptives. No. Instead, we got evolutionary infertility as an explanation, a relatively easy and discreet way to address an issue that, to be fair, most children would not have identified. But it's still a somewhat graceful, if overly convenient, explanation all the same. And this need for world-building explanations that are non-problematic for a young audience also extends to a few other aspects too. One of the common tropes in Dinotopia is that they have largely rejected combustion engines in favour of using the natural size and strength of the larger species for moving goods and people around, which is more sustainable and probably a lot cheaper in the long run. But in a society that has seemingly avoided capitalism, relying instead on barter and exchange, how do you convince the larger dinosaurs to pull, lift and carry? What's in it for them? A partial answer, and another rather convenient one, is given by Arthur when talking in his journal. Because dinosaurs take pride in their immense strength, they do not look down on heavy work. Now, ignoring the common trope of monocultural species in sci-fi and fantasy, where each race has one set of beliefs, one set of characteristics and one type of behaviour, dinosaurs making themselves available as beasts of burden based upon a sense of working pride is a bit of an easy way out from a world-building perspective. It has some of the elements of an anarchist view of labour, removing wage slavery and instituting community safety nets that guarantee a home, food and healthcare, and allowing citizens to do work that is for the benefit of all as opposed to just self-enrichment. Perhaps if we are being generous with our analysis, we can say that there was some intent of that there from Gurney. Certainly, it is a key part of the Dinotopia economic picture that industry and combustion-based engines were rejected in favour of a willing labour force, and without it, much of what is so warm and whimsical about Dinotopia would have been replaced with a very much more human model of factories, pollution, and yes, capital. The final part of the convenient utopia theme I wanted to mention was regarding tolerance. Dinotopia is seemingly a very tolerant place, with many different species coexisting peacefully, whether we are talking about the many different sizes and species of dinosaur, or the nearly as varied human refugees who are washed up upon its shores. National origin remains a significant feature of the human civilian self-identity, with their surnames representing their heritage, the suffix of foremothers African in Toktimbu's case, for example, denoting how many generations of his ancestors have lived here and where they were originally from. And yet, there is little talk of antagonism between the different races and species of Dinotopia, if you exclude the carnivores who reject society anyway. There are occasional hints, like when Arthur and Will ride the dung truck, which now that I think of it sounds like a phrase from Urban Dictionary. We are the only humans aboard. Besides the dinosaur in harness, there is a group of small reptilians who ignore us despite Will's obvious interest in them. This indifference to Will and Arthur is in stark contrast with most of the interactions we see, but it is perhaps indicative of an undercurrent of resentment or cultural rejection. This is mirrored in human form by the interactions of Lee Crab, who resents not being at the top of the food chain and considers Dinotopia a prison for humanity. Dinotopia, he said slowly. You think the name means a utopia of dinosaurs? Wrong. Look it up. It means terrible place. I know, I've seen it. The skinnies are the slaves of the scalies. We're all slaves, hatching their eggs, hauling their dung. The existence of colloquialised racial names for humans and dinosaurs, the assertion of a race-based power dynamic, and the immigrant status of all humans on the island seems a breeding ground for potential conflict, and it is interesting that outside of Crab, who is played as a bit of a crank, and the aloof fellow passengers of the dung cart, we don't really hear or see too much evidence of prejudice. Now, there is part of me that thinks, well, this is a kid's book about dinosaurs. Did you really expect or want to see a racism side plot? But there are enough little nods to it that Gurney has clearly thought about it at least a little. Perhaps this is explored more in the other books of the series, but certainly the absence of racial or immigration-based prejudice does feel a little fantastical at times, though I suppose we do have to bear in mind that my expectations are influenced by where I live. The positive message that a harmonious society is always possible if people actually want it to be is something I am 100% here for, and I think it right that we close this section with this quote again from Arthur and Nallum. "I can't imagine how all these different people and dinosaurs can possibly get along without quarrelling." "Oh, it is possible," said Nallum, sucking thoughtfully on a mango. "Only if you do imagine it." Now, it simply wouldn't be one of my videos if I didn't take a couple of swings at capitalism, and this isn't just because I enjoy my Maggie stinger. One of the most fascinating parts of Dinotopia is the way that its society functions, both as a fantastical land built for the largest creatures to walk the earth, and as a counterpoint to the hashtag real world with all its neoliberal decline, climate change and rampant capitalism. As mentioned in the book walkthrough, Arthur was a pretty wealthy and privileged man before leaving to go on a 2-year expedition with Will after the death of his wife. Anyone that can commission a vessel and crew and not need to work for 2 years obviously has a bit of money in their back pocket. That goes without saying. Plus, we also know that Arthur was a biologist thanks to the inside cover, and being a professor at this point in history would require the funding, privilege and access that pretty much only a historically wealthy family would possess. All of this basically means that Arthur is ideologically challenged when encountering a nation where they do not seemingly possess the concept of capital, where they have rejected currency in favour of bartering, and where the worship of the self is not just taboo, but is philosophically supplanted by a longer-term society-first approach. When he first arrives in Dinotopia, Arthur is definitely amazed by what he finds, but his first instinct is to think of the value it could have for him when he gets back. For a long while, his mind turns to the prestige and kudos that would be coming his way, and every discovery is framed in how it would be regarded in the scientific world, and its value to collectors, museums, and yes, capitalists. However, as Arthur encounters the warmth and caring of a society where sustainability, ethics, and community are the founding principles, he softens, and by the time we get about 2/3 of the way through the book, his focus is no longer on the impact he could make on the outside world. Instead, he realises the value of discovery for its own sake, the value of a place that sees his son's potential in terms of what he can give instead of who his parents are, and the value of a life lived out from under the shadow of capital. This all starts to fall into place when Arthur is shown the Dinotopian tablet, an ancient stone carving that details the core principles of their society. It's egalitarian, it's pacifist, it's communal, it's working to live, not living to work. It's pro-art, it's pro-creativity, it's anti-waste, and it's anti-greed. These sentiments provide a framework that society has been built around, and it may not always be the most efficient or easiest choice, but it would seem the majority of citizens understand that it is worth the effort. This is reflected in several comments where Arthur mentions having taught residents of the island about industrial machines and combustion engines, but they show little interest as they would be pollutive and loud and aggressive and go against the guiding philosophies of the island. I have told them a little about Darwin and Huxley's new theories and have described to their infinite amusement the recent display of life-size dinosaur models at the Crystal Palace in London. They seem relatively uninterested in developments like the compound steam engine. And later on, the engineers study my diagrams with thoughtful respect, but they rarely carry my designs into action. The sewing machine, however, was met with enthusiastic acclaim. They are able to quickly identify the elements of outside world progress that are beneficial and with little to no downside, but can reject concepts that fall outside of their ideological beliefs almost innately. Using the periodic arrival of newcomers, they simply filter new ideas as they arrive and disregard the ones that fall short of their societal expectations. In this way, Dinotopia appears to have been very much able to disregard the creep of capitalism, neoliberalism and renterism. Sounds good, right? Dinotopia is a good time. When I was a kid and obsessing over dinosaurs, this is the sort of thing that would have absolutely blown my mind. A sort of Jurassic Park, but if it was founded by someone that wasn't a massive capitalist like John Hammond. Dennis Nedry wouldn't have needed to do industrial espionage if you paid a living wage, John. James Gurney has started off with a whimsical question. What if humans and dinosaurs could peacefully coexist? And then he has expanded outwards, creating cities and cultures and curios that have fleshed out this fantastical idea into something greater. The joy of world building and of creating something new is in being able to create a living, breathing place, somewhere that continues even when the book is closed, and in this I think Gurney was successful. Whilst we have already acknowledged that we have to suspend disbelief in a few instances, the existence of dinosaur chairs, of ancient pre-Dinotopian ruins, and a behavioural code that underpins the cultural standards of the nation all help us feel like there is a depth and a history to this wonderful place, and encourages us to ponder about what other surprises await us beyond the journals of Arthur Denison. Kindness, community and sustainability underpin much of what makes Dinotopia so warm and joyous. Walking the streets of a city where your wellness and happiness are the priority, seeing strangers open their doors to you out of an instinct of trust and compassion. I highly recommend Dinotopia as a book for kids, and actually there is a fair amount to get from it as an adult too. The amount of thought that James Gurney has put into this world, both as a world builder and as an artist, is really interesting and useful, and I'm considering looking into the other books in the series further down the line, should people show an interest in this video. Let me know your thoughts if you've ever read this book, or if you have any experience of the other books, or even the TV shows for that matter. I'd love to know your thoughts. Thank you so much for your time and interest in this video. It is very much appreciated. If you would like to help me out, please give this video a like and maybe drop a comment with your thoughts on Dinotopia, the video, or world building more generally. These things really help us YouTubers get out in front of people. I would also like to thank Mrs. InsideLeft for their patience, endless support and help with the scripting, Nicko for the microphone, Robert Gordon and Advent Song for the use of their music, and the We Create Together Discord group for providing a sounding board and a place to share the trials and tribulations of trying to create things. Finally, I want to say thank you to James Gurney for creating this world that we've been exploring together and for making our own world a little better than how he found it. Until next time folks, please take care of each other, be kind and be safe comrades. See you soon.